this talk is going to be sex, Buddhism and hobnobs. I'm not really going to talk that much about sex and hobnobs. I don't want to disappoint anyone, but if you were tuning in to all hear about an evening about sex and secret tantric sex or something, I don't think I'm really qualified to talk too much about sex. I probably know more about hobnobs. But for Pascal and Victorine, by the way, maybe Parvika, hobnobs are a kind of an English biscuit, by the way. You may not have, I don't know if you have them in France or not, but they're a very nice biscuit anyway. And if anybody else is from abroad or they're just an English biscuit, just so you know. But this talk is really more about something we're all interested in and we all want. It's pleasure and happiness. So it's kind of a talk about pleasure and happiness and how sex and hobnobs, and more importantly, how Buddhism kind of come into that. So it's easy to kind of, maybe kind of pleasure and happiness aren't the first kind of words people think of when they think about Buddhism or religion in general or any kind of spiritual practice. After all, the first noble truth is the truth that there is suffering. And you can think, and you know, it's easy to think of religion about being lots of rules about things you can't do. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't have fun. But you can see Buddhism as a path of increasing joy and happiness. And it's good to try and see it in that way, because we all want joy and happiness, and so it makes it an attractive thing to do. And it's not really something that's obsessed with. It's not a pessimistic religion. It's a very optimistic religion. But even the Buddha, before he was enlightened, did kind of fall into the trap of thinking that the spiritual path was not about pleasure. As you probably all know the story of the Buddha, but before he was enlightened, when he was striving to find enlightenment, he embarked on a series of ascetic practices where he denied himself any pleasure, and he pushed himself to the point, nearly to the brink of death. And as he was on the brink of death, he had a memory. A memory came to him of when he was a child, sitting happily on a nice summer afternoon, watching his father plough. And he fell into a kind of state of just happiness. He basically fell into a dhyana, a kind of a superconscious state. And as he was thinking about that, he said something interesting. He said, "So why am I afraid of that? Why am I afraid of that pleasure? It has nothing to do with sensuality, nothing to do with unskillful mental qualities." So it's interesting, isn't it? So he says, "Why am I afraid of that pleasure?" So he kind of realizes that there's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing unspiritual about pleasure. And he kind of discovered the middle way, didn't he? So it's the middle way between extreme asceticism and overindulgence in hedonism, the middle way. So there's kind of a recognition that we need pleasure in our spiritual life. If we don't have pleasure in our spiritual life, it will just wither and die eventually, just like the Buddha nearly did. We'll just stop meditating. And we need pleasure in our lives to have a thriving lives, and we need pleasure in our spiritual lives. So this is what that talk's going to be about, basically. There's a quote from Bante that he says, "When poetry ceases to be enjoyable, it ceases to be poetry." And I think you can say it's the same to an extent about spiritual life. But there are, of course, dangers in kind of pleasure seeking and have a hedonistic attitude towards life. So if we have a hobnob, that's going to give us a certain amount of pleasure. But then if we go for another hobnob and keep wanting to try and repeat the pleasure, and we eat a whole packet of hobnobs, that's going to turn into suffering, isn't it? We're not going to feel great. We're not going to feel healthy. So pleasure can very easily turn into pain and addiction and ill health, so on. Feel like we've wasted our time. And we can do that with all sorts of things, can't we? We can reach for pleasure, whether it's pornography, watching Netflix with a pizza all night, endlessly scrolling through YouTube. I don't think any of these things are that wrong, but if we engage in it, if that's how we're getting all our pleasure, then we can just end up wasting a lot of time and having a lot of regret. Yeah, the Buddha said some interesting things about happiness and pleasure. He actually had 3 levels of, in one place he talks about being 3 levels of happiness. So far I've talked mainly about pleasure, but the Buddha talks mainly in happiness. So I'll just talk about the distinction between pleasure and happiness, because the 2 of them overlap and kind of intertwined, I think. I think pleasure is a bit more short-term, isn't it? And so a hobnob will give us pleasure. Probably a hobnob won't bring us happiness. So happiness is something a bit more, I think it's pleasure with meaning. It's something, happiness is something a bit more kind of long-term, when we have our life is engaged in some kind of meaning. So anyway, the Buddha said there were 3 levels of happiness. So there's worldly happiness, which is mainly the pleasures of the senses, and happiness kind of based on externals. So worldly happiness is having a good job, having a good life, having a good family, being successful. Happiness based on externals and happiness based on the physical senses. Then there's unworldly happiness, which is the dhyanas. So the dhyanas, in case you haven't heard of them, are kind of super conscious states that are free of any suffering. So they're free of greed, free of hatred, free of doubt, and free of any kind of negativity. And they're just states of pure happiness. There's 8 of them altogether, and they're kind of described in different ways in the Buddhist tradition. So that's the unworldly happiness. And then there's still greater unworldly happiness. And that's the happiness that comes when we gain insight into the nature of reality. So I'm going to kind of go through each of those 3 levels of happiness, and just say a bit about them, and then we'll go into groups, and we can discuss what comes up from that. And one key thing the Buddha says in the Dhammapada, he says an interesting bit about happiness, which I think is really key. So I'll just say this, because I think it's the key to happiness. He says, if by renouncing a limited happiness, one would see an abundant happiness, let the spiritually mature person, having regard to the abundant happiness, sacrifice the limited happiness. So I'll just say that again. If by renouncing a limited happiness, one would see an abundant happiness, let the spiritually mature person, having regard to the abundant happiness, sacrifice the limited happiness. So essentially, he's talking about how you kind of become happier. It's by not going for immediate gratification. So renouncing a limited happiness means not going for the immediate gratification, and holding out for the more abundant happiness. So in a sense, he's talking about renunciation. He's talking about renunciation, and renunciation may not sound like a very kind of appealing word in a way, but in a way it just sounds like not getting what we want. But actually, it's about not delaying our gratification and holding out for a more abundant, more lasting, more meaningful happiness. And that's a key to kind of ascending the levels of happiness at every level. So there's quite an interesting bit of poetry by Blake, which you've probably all heard a million times, I'm sure, but I think it's a classic piece of poetry. He who binds to himself with joy doth the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. So not holding on to joy, holding on to whatever we have, but letting it go. We were talking a bit about that in the group just now. I was saying how difficult it is to let go of your children as they change so much. Anyway, I think that's key. Anyway, so I'll talk a bit about worldly pleasures. So worldly pleasures is probably our working ground for most people, isn't it? Personally, I'm not in the dhyanas very often at all. So the working ground for me is the worldly pleasures. So we need wholesome pleasures as much as possible, the kind of pleasure that will nourish us and satisfy us. So not so much the pleasures that leave us kind of feeling bad about ourselves and kind of toxic pleasures. We need wholesome pleasures. You kind of have to decide what they are for you. Recently over Christmas, I saw my brother, and he's really got into stargazing. And he was talking about just going out and looking at the stars. And he was so enthusiastic about it. He sent me this picture he made the other day of the moons of Saturn, I think it was. He just took it on his phone. And he's just so excited by that. Dharmajit's quite good. He goes skateboarding. It's good to have some physical activities, isn't it, that get us out of our head. Dharmajit goes skateboarding up one of those, what they call the half pikes or whatever. Friendship, of course. I think friendship is a really great joy, cultivating friendship. So yeah, wholesome pleasures that, in a sense, just make us feel good. I find that it just takes a bit of discipline to do those, instead of just flop out on the sofa sometimes and watch Netflix and eat Doritos or Hobnobs or whatever. It can be hard work sometimes, can't it, to renounce that limited pleasure and go for something which is a bit more kind of nourishing. Read a book or something, read some poetry. Maitreya Bandhu actually talks about integrating pleasure and meaning. He talks about there being a pleasure train and a meaning train. And he says what we tend to do is we get onto the pleasure train, and that's full of kind of pleasures of whatever, food, sex, entertainments of various sorts. And we're on that train for a while, and we get sick of it. It's too much. There isn't enough meaning in it. So we get off the pleasure train and we jump onto the meaning train. And the meaning train's all very kind of goodly and full of kind of very worthy things, but not much pleasure. And we tend to jump from one train to the other. And the key is to integrate pleasure and meaning, to find things that we really enjoy, but are also really meaningful. Sangajit I think Sangajit is a good example of this, in that last time I went to see Sangajit, he lives just outside London, in a small town called Sevenoaks. And I was just getting a lift with him, and he really loves cricket. Cricket has always been like a real passion of his. He's always talking about cricket. And I remember once he gave a talk with his cricket bat on him. And he took me to his cricket club, and he talked about his plans, what he was going to do at this cricket club. He was going to turn it into, they've started doing some fundraising for it, and they're going to build it, make it bigger, and he's going to improve it in various ways, and he's going to do some meditation teaching there, and he wants it to become like an outpost for the London Buddhist Centre. So he's taken something that he really loves, and he's integrated it with something that really means a lot to him as well. And his family are involved as well. His children play cricket. So I think that's a really good way that we can kind integrate parts of our lives. And it's something he can put all his energy into, all his kind of passion, all his skills. So I think we need to find things like that. Probably the best thing you can do to have pleasure, I suppose I would say, is go on retreat. And we have some father retreats that are happening later on this year, but we'll plug them later on. I'm just going to plug them. So that's worldly happiness anyway, the pleasures of the senses. So then moving on to unworldly happiness. So we can be quite successful in the world and have a lot of worldly happiness, be very successful, but it's nothing compared to unworldly happiness, apparently. There's a great and unworldly happiness, as I said before, is the dhyanas, so the super conscious states, free of all kind of negativity. There's a little story about the Buddha, which I'm always telling my kids when they're bored. If they say I'm bored, I say, think about the Buddha when he met the king. I've told them so many times to them that they always kind of, oh no, not this story again. I'm sure you've heard this story as well. It's a story about the Buddha. He goes to meet a king, and a king represents kind of worldly success, worldly power. And the king's kind of got everything he needs. He's got a palace, he's got servants, he's got entertainment. And the king asks him, what makes you happier than me? Who's happier between the two of us? I've got all this wealth and power. And the Buddha says, well, can you sit for an hour and be completely happy without doing anything? And the king says, yes, I think I could manage that. And the Buddha says, could you sit for a whole day and night without doing anything and be completely happy? And the king said, yeah, I think I could manage a day. And the king said, no, I couldn't manage a day. That's impossible. No one could do that. And the Buddha says something like, I can sit for as long as I like, not doing anything, and be completely happy. That's kind of didn't actually happen to the Buddha. I think it's a story that the Buddha told about another Buddha or something, but it's a great story. I like telling it because it indicates that through meditation, the Buddha has kind of developed himself from the inside so much that he doesn't need externals to be happy. He's completely satisfied, completely in bliss from the inside out. So the dhyanas are normally associated with meditation, although I think the first and second dhyanas, you don't need to be meditating to enter. You just need to be doing something which is where your mind is free of negativity. But they're normally associated with meditation. There's a quote from Bhante. He says, the four superconscious states, the so-called lower dhyanas, are within reach of everybody who meditates systematically and regularly. So Bhante chooses his word carefully. So he says, everybody who meditates systematically and regularly. So that means us. We can easily access, well, not easily, we can access the lower dhyanas if we meditate systematically and regularly, according to Bhante. So are we being systematic and regular in our meditation practice? Personally, I'm not a very systematic person, so I've always struggled with this, but I'm really trying to be systematic and regular now. And I think what that means for me is meditating with a kind of plan, not just kind of sitting once a day or whenever I can, and just kind of drifting along and trying to do the metabhavana mindfulness, but really trying to see what's going on in my mind. So if the hindrances are arising, if there's anger or ill will or so on, or greed or doubt or whatever, seeing what's going on in my mind and seeing what keeps coming up each time, and then trying to do something about that in my life, in my ethics, and then just being systematic about it. What are the hindrances that are coming up, and what can I taking action to do something about them? I think, obviously some of us won't have much time to meditate. We might have young children and whatever. And, it might be difficult to sit at all, but we can still have a plan. We can still, even if our plan is just to try and drop into our bodies and just experience having a body, that can be kind of our plan. That's a great thing to do on its own. It's a great skill just to be able to experience the direct sensations of your body. That in itself will be good. But have a plan in meditation. I think that's really important. The mind is so important in Buddhism, isn't it? And meditation could be such a kind of a crucial kind of way to really benefit and lead a much more fulfilling life, and really taking that seriously. Having a systematic and regular practice, and we can get into good states even if we have busy lives. And again, if we can get on retreat from time to time, so much the better. But we can, even in our busy lives, get into really good states. So really trying to see if we can do that. So now we talk about still greater unworldly happiness. So even the wonderful pleasures of the dhyanas can be a trap, just like the worldly pleasures. We can get kind of addicted to just having pleasure, but we haven't gained insight yet necessarily, just by experiencing the pleasures of dhyana. So again, as from the Buddha's life, he kind of illustrates this. Before he's enlightened, he manages to kind of, his teachers, the first teachers he has, teach him how to get into very exalted states, into the dhyanas. But he says, I thought this teaching does not lead to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nirvana. I left to pursue my search. So he recognizes that it's not a permanent fix, this pleasure. And he went on for more. He went on to find, he was renouncing that limited pleasure for an even greater pleasure still. So the still greater unworldly pleasure and happiness is insight into the nature of reality. What I want to concentrate on here is something that Bhante really kind of personified in his life, and that's the appreciation of beauty. So Bhante really talked about a fourth lakshana. So if you don't know, in Buddhism, when you to attain insight, what you traditionally do is you get into the dhyanas, hopefully, and then try and reflect on three lakshanas, which are impermanence, insubstantiality, and suffering. There's also a fourth one that Bhante and one of his teachers talked about, and that was ugliness. And the samadhi or doorway associated with ugliness is beauty. And Bhante has said that it's the imaginal faculty, is a faculty through which we'll become enlightened. So it's the imagination, the imaginal faculty. And Subhuti actually says he thinks this lakshana might be the best one for us to try and reflect on to gain insight. And because to cultivate the imaginal faculty, to improve the imaginal faculty, we can use the arts. We can use poetry and literature and the visual arts and so on. And they're extremely pleasurable. He really kind of embodies someone who had an incredibly alive imagination, Bhante. He did all that reading when he was young, when he was confined to a bed, reading Milton, for example, when he was a teenager. And that obviously kind of really ignited his imagination. And I think all the people I know who I kind of admire and look up to, in the spiritual life, order members and you know, Bhante and Subhuti and Maitreya Bandhu, who ordained me, I think they all have a really alive imagination. Whenever I see Maitreya Bandhu, who's always enthusing about poetry or a film he saw, a piece of music or a book he's reading. And I'm not a massively cultured person, but this year I really want to kind of get into poetry and really want to challenge myself in terms of, you know, listening to different types of music, classical music and so on. Because I think that arts is a really enjoyable way of kind of refining ourselves and giving us a kind of a rich, imaginative vocabulary, which is incredibly useful in the spiritual life. And it's, yeah, I think art and the arts can be a carrier of insight for us. So I'm really trying to challenge myself to get into poetry. There's bits and pieces of poetry I like, but a lot of the time, I read a classic poem or something, and it really annoys me because I can't understand it. And sometimes it feels quite hard to kind of, I think, am I stupid or what? Well, I'm standing in front of a painting, a masterpiece at the National Gallery. And I'm just standing there and I'm thinking, nothing is happening. What? This is supposed to be a classic. But so sometimes it can be hard to challenge ourselves to go a bit further, you know. But sometimes it just comes, you know, it just comes alive, doesn't it? And we come alive and we really enjoy a piece of music or a great piece of art that really touches our imagination. So I think wisdom, insight, is not just being really clever, is it? There's an emotional aspect to us. There's three levels of wisdom. There's listening and reflecting and realizing. And I think reflecting is not just intellectual, it's really our imagination coming alive. And we can do that with the arts. And you know, you may not be like me, you may not be massively cultured, but everybody's got an imagination and everyone can develop that. And as Bhante says, that's how we become enlightened through our imaginal faculty. So I was in my chapter the other day, and one of the guys was reading an old seminar of Bhante's, and Bhante was saying to these order members who are there, I hope you're not listening to, are you still listening to rock music and jazz? Why don't you listen to some classical music? So that really got us talking, you know, because we all like a bit of rock music and jazz and things. And we were saying, well, is that what we should be listening to? I think Bhante can be quite challenging in the seminar sometimes, and as he should, you know, as our teacher, he should challenge us to challenge our thinking and so on. And I think we need to start where we are. If we enjoy what we enjoy, and we need to find pleasure. But I think we also need to challenge ourselves in the arts to, and you know, not just the arts, but the food we eat, the entertainment we have. Even if it's just a small way, try and be less crude in our ethics and so on. Finally, I just want to finish with a point about a bit of an altruistic point, because I've talked a lot about pleasure and happiness for ourselves, and it can feel a bit, I don't know, a bit centered around me and being individualistic. So the great 8th century Buddhist monk Shantideva said, all those who suffer in the world do so because of their desire for their own happiness. All those happy in the world are so because of their desire for the happiness of others. So I think that the ultimate integration of pleasure and meaning is seeing that your happiness is tied up with others. And when you live for others' happiness, that's what you're kind of, that's what you're kind of, what gives you pleasure. So that's what it's all about, really, I think, isn't it? Is trying to get to that point, taking pleasure in other people's happiness. So just in summary then, so we need pleasure. We need pleasure in our spiritual life. We need it in our life. We need to renounce limited pleasure and cultivate ever more wholesome pleasures. We need to always be letting go of pleasures. We need to integrate pleasure and meaning. And we need to try and be systematic in our meditation practice. And the arts is a great way to integrate pleasure and meaning. So we'll go into groups now. And I have a few suggestions for what you could talk about. You could talk about what you want really in the groups, but I quite like talking about what, or hearing about what people enjoy, what gives them pleasure. That to me creates a lot of pleasure in itself. It's a good way to find out about people. I'm always asking people what their favorite film is, because I like just hearing people enthuse about what they're into. So we could do a bit of that. Maybe you could have a think about, do you get enough pleasure? Are your pleasures kind of toxic pleasures? Are they kind of more nourishing pleasures? How can you plan in more pleasures? How can you get serious about pleasure in terms of, you know, planning it in and being serious about it, especially if you've got a family? Sometimes as a parent, you could be the last one you kind of think about it in terms of having pleasure. It can all be about your children's pleasure. So how can we find pleasure? One thing, when my kids were a bit younger, I started reading poetry to them, and it was just like a poem every day after dinner, and it's kind of children's poetry it was, so it's kind of my level, but it was good. It was good poetry, you know. It was just fun. It was just playing with words, and the children, my kids really loved it. But anyway, yeah, maybe you can think about, are you having enough pleasure, and how can you get more? How can you get more happiness? Great, and yeah, thanks for listening.